So I will share my screen. Thank you very much for that introduction. As Clara has said, this paper is based on my work at a summer school. So yes, I am the director of the Cambridge School Classics project. I was a teacher previous to that. I have also worked in educational policy and worked with the UK government on the national curriculum for classics in the UK. So the summer school I work on, I've worked on it for around 8 or 9 years. And it is a very varied school. This is not a summer school for students who are failing or students who need extra help. It's for students who want to do more study in their vacation. It is a classics summer school, but we don't focus on the language, which in my experience, it makes us quite unusual. We focus on the literature, philosophy, history, largely in translation. There are language classes, but they are not compulsory. A lot of students will not do language with us. They will come to us to study history, literature in translation, philosophy, or areas of the classical world they haven't seen anywhere else yet. It's quite short. There are just 4 full days of teaching, and each core course, therefore, is 4 lessons long. So you only have 4 hours with your students for that particular course. The teaching staff are a very close-knit, very tight-knit bunch, and we are given a lot of freedom in what we teach. There is no syllabus that is given to us. We are given the course title and tiny bit of description, and then we can do whatever we want, which is lovely and very unusual as a teacher. I've taught a huge range of topics over the years, but I have become known on the school as the person who does philosophy mainly, and also gender. I have never taught the reception course before last year, but because somebody else left and couldn't do the school, I picked up the reception course. It was something I was interested in. The students on the summer school are this is a picture of one of our summer schools, so these are the kinds of kids, and the staff are in there too. The students are between 16 and 19 years old. They're from a range of backgrounds with a range of classics experience. Some of them are studying Latin or Greek at school. Some of them have never done anything classical ever. And we have all of these kids all in together. So I was in 2021, I was asked to speak at the conference Reception Studies State of the Discipline, hosted online by Massey University in New Zealand. And at that conference, on the same panel as me, was Caitlin Hines from Wake Forest University. And she gave a paper detailing a course called Ancient Worlds, Modern Crises that she taught at Wake Forest in 2020. Caitlin was kind enough to share her course schedule and her reading and her resource list with the group. And I was struck by how interesting her approach was and how, and I started thinking about whether you could do something similar with school age, older, but school age students. By the way, as we go through, the quotes in pink on all of my slides, the one that's down here. These are all from the students that I taught. I have put them through all of the slides, so anything in pink, that is one of my students. So when I took over the reception course for this summer school, I wanted to see if I could not adapt Caitlin's work, but be inspired by Caitlin's work at Wake Forest and do something similar aimed at the students that I taught on the summer school. So on the screen, you have, this is a whole semester of teaching at Wake Forest, and you have the titles of the different sections of Caitlin's course. She covered, as you can see, quite a range of material and issues. So the aims for me, obviously teaching in a different context, I wanted to include a variety of modern issues which would be meaningful to 16 to 19-year-olds. Some of the issues raised by Caitlin in her course, they wouldn't really be as, they wouldn't interest or engage a 16-year-old in the same way as they might engage a 21-year-old. It's a different life experience level. I also was very keen to include scholarship and references which are inclusive of scholars of colour and marginalised groups. And I wanted to approach all the issues with honesty and integrity. Basically, I wanted, if I was going to do a course of this nature, I wanted to do it in a way that I felt comfortable with, I felt honest about, and I thought the students would see as legitimate. Students are smart. They know when you are hiding things or changing things or not being honest with them. You think you're being really clever as their teacher and you're putting things you don't want to talk about over here. No, students know, they know. And I didn't want that to be how we approach these issues. If I was going to talk about something in my classroom, I wanted it to be something I felt that I could really open the room to, not hide things. The challenges with doing this is I only had 4 hours available to teach. That is not very much time. And I don't know these students. And if there are people with a lot of teaching experience in the audience, you will know that when you are dealing with difficult or sensitive topics, something that's really important is to know your students, to know how they might respond to things. So this is actually a very, very difficult thing to do cold without knowing your kids. Age appropriate. I have to be careful, you know, I do not want parents complaining to me that their children are upset. I do need to think about what is appropriate for students of this age and this level of life experience. And also, finally, I didn't want to put them off classics. I want these to be students who go away inspired to learn more about the classical world, not students who are now scared of the classical world. And I was worried that that could be the outcome. So I was really, really careful. Ooh. So before I actually get into how I built my curriculum and how my students responded to it, I just want to take a few minutes to talk about trauma-informed teaching. Trauma-informed teaching is a very specific type of teaching. And trauma-informed practice is not just a teaching thing. You find being trauma-informed is something you see in social work, you can apply it in the police. It's a mode of practice that is relevant to anyone who is working with other humans. You know that. So I personally believe in and promote trauma-informed teaching. It's been shown to be one of the best ways to handle sensitive issues and individuals who have trauma in their history. And often I get asked to explain how to do it. Unfortunately, the answer to that is largely, I can't tell you how to do trauma-informed teaching as a tiny part of quite a short paper, but I can give you some pointers, and I'm happy to kind of elaborate in questions if you wish me to. So trauma-informed teaching is, it's the reason I've chosen this image on the screen, the rock with waves crashing on it. As a teacher or just an adult dealing with children, or anyone in responsibility or authority, you need, in a situation where you are dealing with somebody with a traumatic history or material which is traumatizing, you need to be the rock. You need to be solid. You need to not move. You are not bringing energy to the space. You are the solid. You are the still thing. And the energy that is produced by your students or those that you are dealing with, or the issue, the energy the issue brings to the space, that has to bounce off you, because your students need you to be calm and centered and clear. Your emotions, have them. You know, don't pretend you don't, but don't have them with your students necessarily. Go out with your colleagues and have a large glass of wine afterwards. You know, that's where your emotions go. With your students, calm, center, not boring, not disinterested, but calm. You don't get upset. If they get upset, you work with them, but you don't do it yourself. Never aim to shock, surprise, or distress. Just please don't. Some of you may think, well, of course I wouldn't do that, but often we do. We want students to understand how awful something is. So we go full on, and we want them to understand how painful it is for this marginalized group, how awful it is to be somebody who's been oppressed. All you're doing there is taking something very horrible and sort of pushing it at the student. And if they can't cope with that, or they have something in their own lives which touches on that, you're pushing it on them. So don't shock them. Your students will know when something is awful. If they don't realize that oppression and violence are awful things, that's not a problem you can fix in a classroom, you know? Create a safe space with what I refer to as escape routes. Essentially what this means is make sure your students know that they can move around the room, they can leave, they know that you're not going to suddenly ask them to answer a question now and not think about, and you know, keep things quite neutral. Meet them where they are. Exercises which are quite free and open are really useful. Allowing them to bring what they want to bring to it, as opposed to answer this question in this way and you have to do it now. You know, free writing, open questioning, open discussions, small group discussions, much easier. And yes, be aware of your surroundings, be aware of yourself, and be available. If you are someone who is very pushed for time, we all are, and you don't want your students to hang around at the end of the lesson and talk to you, you don't want them turning up at your office, actually think really carefully about whether you should be teaching this material. Because if you are bringing these things into these students' lives, they need to process it. And you need to be comfortable and happy to be there as they do that. So if they need to come up to you at the end of the lesson and say, can I talk to you for 5 minutes? Or you've made me think about something and I just want to ask you a question. Or even if they just need 5 minutes just to sit, you owe them that. You know, you can't, it's not, I finished the lesson, now go. You know, you have to be aware that people are going to settle at different rates and be able to handle that. So this is my curriculum, with thanks to Caitlin Hines. So we started off by discussing what's in a name. This was intended to be one session and it turned into two, because that's what happens sometimes. So within these 2 hours, we covered a lot of material. As you can see, I put my references, the reference in the material that we used. Obviously, we didn't read all of these articles in full. These are the things that I used to inform my lesson plan, but also we used quotes from it and sections from them. I have a reading list document that if anybody is interested, I can circulate. It was a list of suggested reading I gave to the students. So we looked at why is the discipline called classics. I will admit to being in my late 20s before I even thought about why the discipline is called classics. As far as I was concerned, it was just an odd name for ancient history. And I hadn't really thought about the values inherent in that name. And so we unpicked that as a group. We looked at Rebecca Fruto Kennedy's conversations about who and what we think of as classical. We looked at dictionary definitions, and we also looked at the Promoting Beautiful Frederick Civic Architecture Act signed by Donald Trump, because of course we did. And you may be thinking, why? Why did you do that? Well, because there's classical reception in everything, including legislation by Donald Trump. Quote, societies have long recognized the importance of beautiful public architecture. Ancient Greek and Roman public buildings were designed to be sturdy and useful, and also to beautify public spaces and inspire civic pride. Skip a bit. President George Washington and Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson consciously modeled the most important buildings in Washington, D.C. on the classical architecture of Athens and Rome. So we had a conversation as a group about why Donald Trump was writing into law the requirement to copy building styles from ancient Europe in modern America, which brought us very neatly into a conversation about America, Sparta, and the far right. We looked at Carl Chapman and the appropriation of Molon Labe, and we looked at the rebuttals offered by people like Sarah Bond. And then we looked at European colonization. Emily Greenwood's book, Afro-Greeks, is fantastic. I hugely recommend. We also looked at the Indian civil service, and just one of my favorite quotes I found is actually from the Keith Sanderford and Brian Stoddard 1998 book. You may be looking at that and thinking, the imperial game, like that's about cricket. Yes, yes, it is. They describe the British imperial project as being based on 3 C's: cricket, Christianity, and classics. And I think it is possibly one of the best descriptions of British colonialism I've ever heard, because yeah, pretty much. I mean, the army's there as well, but in terms of cultural domination, cricket, classics, and Christianity. And also, obviously, classics had a major role to play in the administration of empire. Up until, you know, the mid-20th century, we were still examining whether somebody was fit to be an administer a civil servant in India on whether they could pass a Latin exam, which is a very odd thing to do when you think about it. We love Latin, everyone in this room, I'm assuming, but most of us wouldn't think that it made you particularly well qualified to work in the Indian government. And then we looked at some basically art and literature created by different sort of black artists such as Derek Walcott, or Southern Americans such as the Cuban Jose Marti, Basically, we looked at how art and literature is then used in areas which were colonized to almost respond to the colonization. So this idea of the classics being pushed in one direction and then pushed back in the other by the colonized. We then moved on to look at misogyny. This was obviously, and I'm sure people will not be surprised, drew very heavily on the work of Donna Zuckerberg, including her book, Not All Dead White Men. We looked at the pickup artist movement in America. I don't know if you have a similar movement that arrived in France as well, or whether it's just unfortunately the America and Britain that got this thrown at us. I was very careful with this, actually. Obviously, I was reasonably careful with the Ovid selections that we worked in translation. I basically took the quote that's on the screen from Julia Hedjuk, where she basically says how funny Ovid's Ars Amatoria is. And we looked at it and we just thought, is this funny? Is the way that it's being interpreted by modern individuals funny? Was Ovid actually being funny? You know, and we actually looked at the value systems inherent in it. We also looked at one of the, what I refer to as one of the tamer pickup artists. His name is Mystery. Yes, he chose to call himself Mystery to improve his social skills. And he had created a method of how to pick up women. And he wrote books. And he appeared on TV shows. I showed them a clip. I showed them a clip from a Saturday night talk show in America where Mystery gives I think it's David Letterman, gives an interview about what he does. So I was very careful to, yes, we looked at pickup artists, but I deliberately didn't dig in to the nastier stuff. And this is a huge content warning to anyone who does anything looking in this area. If you delve into that side of the internet, it's awful. And actually, this is one of my reflections, if I teach this again, is I was very careful what I brought into the room. I underestimated the power of teenagers with Google. And they came into my following lesson quite upset. Not by anything I'd said, but because they had gone and they had found some of the misogyny and hatred of women that is on the internet. So we had to have a conversation about the fact that the internet is a rubbish fire and should never, it was quite hard for them to realize that there are people that hateful in the world. And I think actually, I don't think we can protect them from that. It wasn't age inappropriate, it just shocked them. And so I think what I would do the next time is actually talk to them about the fact that we're looking at one of the tamer examples and actually be really honest with them that there are far worse people out there. And if you start Googling, you are going to find them and they are horrible. And actually just allow them to make that decision a little bit more informed. I think they weren't anticipating how awful some hatred towards women is on the internet. We think of teenagers as being very knowledgeable about the world sometimes, and they aren't. They're not adults. They do a very good impression of being adults sometimes, but they aren't. They don't have the life experience. And so sometimes they will underestimate things, and that's one of them. And then the final session we did, I'm delighted that one of them felt it restored their faith in humanity. I'm a little bit worried that I've broken their faith in humanity. We looked at tragedy and trauma. We looked at the BAME Medea, which is an all BAME Black, Asian, minority, ethnic is what that stands for in the UK. production of the Medea at Oxford University. There are loads and loads of resources on this. The link on the slide is actually to a blog post I did in my work life, which links through to all their resources rather than linking them all individually. And we also looked at the project Theatre of War, which is a project in the US, which started off focusing on combat veterans. And we started off looking at how basically these two projects used Greek tragedy to address societal or personal trauma. In terms of the BAME Medea, when we listen to the producer and director talk about it, there are interviews with them available online, they express how the act of putting on this tragedy is a method of catharsis for them as minority students within a university which is predominantly white and whose rules and structures they do not feel represent them. And so in taking on Euripides' Medea and recasting Medea, they felt that they could articulate their own struggles in this play in a very, in my opinion, very Greek way. They recast the choruses using a mixture of world music, and they basically tried to use a lot of different, they brought personal cultures into it. So the makeup artists used makeup traditions from various different heritages to try and basically bring as much into the production that they felt was lacking in the environment that they found themselves in Oxford. Theatre of War is very different. Theatre of War looks at the way in which listening to, for example, Philoctetes or Ajax might be a way for combat veterans to cope with the post-traumatic symptoms that they are left with. This proved to be so successful. There are beautiful videos on their website. I couldn't pick, so go on there and click around and go and look. They've done similar projects with domestic violence, with protest, with refugees. But yes, they started off doing it with combat veterans. And it's a very similar kind of idea, is the idea that the individuals who have suffered can see their suffering sort of reflected in a piece of ancient literature that's being performed, and it can help them think and reflect on their own pain, which again is actually a very Greek idea. So the last little section of this, what I want to talk about is, how do I know if this worked? So for some of you, you may be sitting there thinking, this all sounds lovely, but you don't know what did the students get from it? Do you know it worked? You know, this all sounds very worrying. I would be too worried to do this in case the students would hate it. So obviously this is my first time of teaching it. I only had 10 students in my class, but I gave them a course evaluation, and I want to share with you some of their thoughts on being taught this course. So there were 10 students in my class. 2 of them were 18, the rest were 17. I had 1 male student, 2 non-binary, and 7 female. There were 2 students of colour. One of them was black. The other one, I don't know what her heritage is, but she was American, and she would have identified as a person of colour. From an access to classics point of view, one of them had absolutely no access to classics at school. 3 had done what we call classical civilization, which is classics in translation, and Latin. One of them did Greek in their spare time. 4 of them only had classical civilization. They had never done any language. Another had class civ at school, but it wasn't specified what kind of level. So most of these students Only one of them had no classics at school. Most of them had done something. So this wasn't the first time they were being introduced to classics. So these are the questions I asked my students. They are fairly standard. They're not particularly exciting, but one thing I want to really highlight is I didn't lead, well, I tried not to lead them. I wanted them to tell, I want to improve as a practitioner, and I wanted them to tell me what they hated. If they hated it, I wanted to know. So I tried to invite criticism as well as praise. For example, were there any sessions you liked less for any reason? I also asked neutral questions. So what your biggest takeaway is, what are you taking away? Has this course impacted how likely you are to study classical subjects? Not are you more likely or are you less likely, just is there a change? These were all done anonymously. They could tell me who put their name on if they wanted to, but most of them didn't. And it was basically a free writing exercise. And I actually found these to be absolutely fascinating. And the students stayed behind after class to finish their questionnaires. They wrote so much. I'd given them a piece of paper with these, with boxes on. They got extra paper to keep writing. So they had thoughts. They definitely had opinions. So I want to share with you some of the big takeaways for me. So first up is, did they enjoy it? Did they enjoy it? 9 o'clock in the morning, a very strange woman standing in front of them and telling them really depressing things. Yes, yes, they did. Who knew? So no, absolutely none of my students reported they didn't enjoy it. In fact, all of them, and none of the responses were even lukewarm. They all told me that they absolutely loved it. Lots of them used superlative language. Well, all of them used superlative language. Some of them, they would say that it's their favorite course. Basically, all of them actively really enjoyed the experience. All students responded that they liked all the sessions. I was really surprised. I was expecting the misogyny session to be a bit meh. I wasn't as happy with it as a teacher. I didn't think I did it as well as I could have done, but apparently they didn't notice. So, and even when talking about being uncomfortable, what I really value and appreciate is the students did say that they were uncomfortable a lot, but that's not a bad thing to them. They say I was uncomfortable, but I don't see that as a bad thing. That's just a thing. I wasn't happy about some of the material being sort of talked about. It's not something you're happy about, but they found the experience of being uncomfortable challenging and positive. You know, this is the thing, when we hide things from students and pretend they're not there because we don't want them to be uncomfortable, students don't want that very often. They want to be allowed to be uncomfortable. They don't want to be forced to be uncomfortable, but if they want to grapple with something, they want the challenge. So next up was the engagement with the material. It's one thing for students to say, I loved it, but then they don't do anything with it. They never read a book on it. They never think about it again. They leave your classroom and that's it. And what was lovely is that this didn't, again, seem to be the case. So all students gave specific takeaways. One of the reasons I asked for their takeaways is I wanted to see if there was anything they remembered. You know, I wanted it something, and all of them, I was expecting very vague answers. I was expecting, some people use classics wrong. They're very vague. I got really detailed responses. They referenced the American gun gun rights lobby and their use of Molon Labe. They mentioned the impact that watching a tragedy can have on someone with combat trauma. They were really specific. Many mentions in the feedback and in person when I chatted to them of how many of their friends and family they'd been sharing their learning with. I would have loved to hear some of the phone calls home during the summer school. Oh yes, this morning I studied far-right activism at 9 o'clock. I had no parent complaints, so fine. It's interesting to note that the students of colour and those who were non-binary expressed particularly strong views around a feeling of inclusion, both in the classroom, but also the wider discipline. I found this really, really interesting. Both students of colour in my classroom specifically raised the fact that they had felt not 100% convinced that they fitted for classics. And it was really marked that both of them raised it without being asked to. The fact that they were like, no, I now feel a bit more like I can come into this discipline. I can't really say much more on this slide. Often we're told, oh, don't do this kind of thing with students. You'll put them off. No, you won't. Every single one of my students said they were more likely to study classical subjects. Every single one of them. I mean, these are a self-selecting group. They chose to be on a summer school. But I found it remarkable, they weren't even neutral. It wasn't, oh, it's made no impact really. Every single one of them said that they wanted to study it more. And these are just, I'm just going to leave the quotes on the screen for a little bit because these are literally what the students said. I couldn't pick which quotes to use for this slide. So yes, from a classics outreach point of view, if we are looking to grow our subject and encourage children and young people to come into the subject, far from needing to hide or skirt away from the hard bits, it seems that actually young people actually appreciate the opportunity to come at the harder parts of the subject and the discipline. And this is a personal triumph that I appreciate. I really appreciate the fact that all students, they expressed an increased awareness. And for me, I went into teaching not just because I wanted my students to be better at my academic subjects. I do believe that teaching is about helping young people to become better adults, or more aware adults, or more engaged adults, or something. I think that is part of the nature of being a teacher. It's not giving them your views, it's enabling them to be better informed about their views. And what I found really interesting, the one that I was really struck by, the young man who was in my class, he stayed behind after the misogyny lesson, and he was horrified that there are men in the world who hate women. It had never occurred to him that men would hate women, which kind of broke my heart a little bit, because I wish I lived in a world where I didn't believe that some people hate women. I want to live in his world. And it was a very positive thing, because he was like, right, no, I can't believe that I share the world with men, with other men who think like this. What do I do to be better around helping to stop this? And we had a really good conversation about being respectful, lifting up the voices of women, challenging male friends if they say something that actually you think isn't okay, saying something. And I like to think that's a really important conversation to be having with young men. You know, it's something that was very important. And I was really struck by his reaction, actually. It was really interesting. So I want to end with one particular student. This particular student was very sheltered. She went to a very religious school. She was brought up very strictly. Her parents were very, very strict. And she was very shy. And she struggled. And she and I had a few conversations about whether she wanted to stay with the course. And she said she did. And her friends were brilliant. Her friends supported her. I supported her. And she really, really thought a lot about everything we were talking about. And she found some things really upsetting. And we took the time with her, and I spent time with her to make sure she was okay. And one of the conversations, she said, why is it important to think about these things? I don't want to think about bad things. I was like, okay. So I used the example of cleaning the kitchen, because I hate cleaning. It's not fun. I hate it. And I said, when you're older and you have your own house, there will be times, or when you're a student, we've all done it, when you look in a drawer or a cupboard and you see something that you probably should get rid of, and you don't, because you don't want to, and it's not a very nice job, so you leave it. And then you come back, and the thing that was a small, like an apple with a bit of mold on it, it's all over your fridge or your cupboard, and it's horrible. And the job is now so horrible, and it's going to take you ages. So that's why it's important as humans to sometimes look in our cupboards, to look at our views, look at our actions, and think, is this something that I think is a good thing for me to believe? Why do I believe it? Why am I doing these things? And just check in. So if there's something that we don't like an apple with some mold on it, we can just pick it up and throw it away and not leave it to get big when it becomes harder. And she nodded, she thought about it. And I'd like to share with you her questionnaire in full. So she commented that the white supremacy and racism topic was very out of her comfort zone. And I know it was. And she didn't dislike any topics. She took away from the course that she can use her sensitivity to change the world. Has this course changed anything? How for all the bad people in the world, there are plenty of good people. She's actually off to university to study classics, but she feels more informed about the decisions that she's going to study. If you had to describe this course in one sentence: a safe place where you feel like you belong and you can be heard. And is there anything that she wants me to know? I feel ready to open my cupboards. And I am going to finish there, and I will take questions if there is time.